Thomas Pelham was born in London on the 21st of July 1693 and went on to study at Westminster School and also at Clare College in Cambridge in 1710. His uncle died in 1711 and his father followed the next year, both leaving their large estates to their nephew and son. When he came of age in 1714, he was one of the greatest landowners of the kingdom and enjoyed enormous patronage in the country of Sussex, though one stipulation of his uncle's will was that he added Holles to his name, which he faithfully did, thereafter styling himself as Thomas Pelham-Holles. Unlike his father and uncle, he increasingly identified with Whig politics, diverging from them as he grew increasingly more partisan and militant in his views, rather than their moderate views. At the time, politically, Britain was divided between the Whigs, who favoured the succession of George of Hanover after Queen Anne's death, and Tories, supporters of the return of Jacobite James Stuart. The issue was to have a profound effect on Pelham-Holles. Due to his political allegiances, he joined the Hanover Club and the Kit Kat Club. Both were leading centres of Whig thinking and organisation. Pelham-Holles helped to sustain the Whigs after Queen Anne's death, having much influence in making Londoners accept George I, even organising the so-called Newcastle mobs to fight with rival Jacobites in the streets. His services were ultimately too great to be neglected by the new Hanoverian king, and in 1714 he was created Earl of Clare, and in 1715 the Duke of Newcastle upon Tyne, two titles previously held by his late uncle John Holles. Pelham-Holles also became Lord Lieutenant of the counties of Middlesex and Nottingham, alongside also becoming a Knight of the Garter. In his new position, he became in charge of suppressing Jacobitism in the counties under his control, and in Middlesex alone he arrested and questioned 800 people, and drew up a voluntary defence association to defend the county. Also, in 1715, he became involved in a riot that ended with 2 men being killed. Pelham-Holles fled along the rooftops. The succession of George I was secured in late 1715 by the defeat of a Jacobite army at the Battle of Preston and the subsequent flight of the Old Pretender James Stuart. The victory of the Hanoverians over the Jacobites marked the beginning of the Whig ascendancy, which lasted for much of the 18th century. This was also largely due to, in the eyes of George I, the Tory opposition being tainted by their support of the Jacobite pretenders. He didn't trust them, instead he drew all of his ministers and officials from the Whigs. Following their victory in the election of 1715, the Whigs split, with one group forming the government for George I, and the other, dissident Whigs, became the effective opposition in Parliament. However, Pelham-Holles himself was soon to see his own influence increase. After a period of political manoeuvring, Pelham-Holles was associated with a Whig faction led by James Stanhope, but from 1720 he began to identify strongly with the government Whigs, who had quickly come to be dominated by Robert Walpole. Walpole gladly welcomed him into his circle because he believed he could easily control him, as well as strengthening his own hand against the rival Whig factions. So, Pelham-Holles joined with him because he believed correctly that Walpole was going to dominate British politics for a generation. 1721 saw the ascension of Walpole as what we now see as Prime Minister, holding the position for the next 21 years. In the beginning, he was joined by Charles Townshend, who Pelham-Holles was related to, which strengthened his bond with the leader of the new administration. On the 2nd of April 1717, however, he increased his Whig connections by marrying Lady Henrietta Godolphin, granddaughter of the Duke of Marlborough, a national hero following his victories in the recent European War, also known as the War of Spanish Succession, and was considered a Whig icon. However, she suffered from poor health, and the couple never had children. At 23 years old, Pelham-Holles first attained high political office as Lord Chamberlain of the household, and was also given the responsibility of overseeing theatres. Plays were often extremely political, and Pelham-Holles was tasked with suppressing any plays or playwrights that he believed to be too critical of the Hanoverian succession or the Whig government. He clashed repeatedly with Sir Richard Steele, a leading playwright at the time. He held the post for 7 years and performed well enough to be considered for further promotion. Despite his youth, he had demonstrated his strength in several general elections when he had been able to get as many 20 MPs elected to seats that he controlled through his family's wealth and political patronage. He survived in office during the turmoil in the Whigs between 1717 and 1721, and his switch of allegiance to Walpole secured his influence thereafter. Walpole had overseen a brief end to the rift between the Whig factions after the collapse of the South Sea Company, which left thousands ruined. Pelham-Holles himself had lost £4,000 due to this. Walpole was then seen as the only man capable to bring stability to the country and the Whigs, and he was granted unprecedented powers, effectively making him the first PM. During his time in office, Pelham-Holles and his wife had become famous for throwing lavish parties, attended by much of London society, including many of his political opponents. He also oversaw a major overhaul of public buildings, many of which had fallen into extremely poor repair. He was also very fond of fox hunting, specifically going to Bishopstone, one of his properties, specifically for that purpose. In 1724, Pelham-Holles was chosen by Walpole to be Secretary of State for the Southern Department, in place of Lord Carteret, a move largely engineered by Townshend. He had been, for some time, considered the third most important man in the government, behind Walpole and Townshend, which was then confirmed by his new position. Pelham-Holles had, for several years, been growing increasingly interested in foreign affairs, educating himself on the subtle details of diplomacy and the European state system. However, his first few years in the office had him defer control of British foreign policy to the other Secretary of State, Townshend. Pelham-Holles effectively served as his deputy. Walpole, however, was generally happy to allow Townshend to control foreign affairs, as he agreed with him on most issues. Since the Treaty of Utrecht, which had ended the last major European war, the War of the Spanish Succession, Britain had been an ally of France. This was a strong reversal in policy, as France had previously been considered the premier enemy of Britain. The reasons for this alliance were complex, and many doubted the friendliness could last long, but when Pelham-Holles became Secretary of State, they had been allies for nearly a decade. By 1719, they had become part of a wider quadruple alliance, which was by far the most powerful force in European politics, demonstrated during the War of the Quadruple Alliance, a largely naval war in the Mediterranean, by which the powers defeated a Spanish attempt to reclaim lost territory in Italy. The alliance was unpopular, however, with many in Parliament and in the country, which continued to consider France to be Britain's natural enemy. Pelham-Holles, however, at this time had been joined in government by his younger brother Henry Pelham. They got on well, but were prone to disputes on issues where neither would budge. One constant source of tension was Pelham-Holles' poor handling of the family fortune, which was being constantly depleted through his out-of-control spending. Henry was also considered by many to be the abler of the two, but it was Pelham-Holles who was initially more successful in politics. In spite of their differences, they remained firm political allies. The administration faced a crisis in 1727 when George I died unexpectedly, following which his son, George II, succeeded to the throne. George II previously had exceptionally bad relations with Walpole and Pelham-Holles. During one altercation between them, George's poor English made Pelham-Holles think he had challenged him to a duel. Their relationship had not improved in recent years, and many anticipated the imminent replacement of the government. Surprisingly, Walpole made himself extremely useful to George II, who soon became convinced of his competence and retained him in his post. The easing of relations between them was helped by the friendship between Pelham-Holles and George's daughter, Amelia, leading many to suspect, without any real substantive evidence, that they were having an affair. By November 1727, Walpole and Pelham-Holles' positions were both safe once more, boosted by an election victory that saw them again gain 430 seats to the opposition's 128 in the House of Commons. In 1729, a rift broke out in the government over the direction of Britain's foreign policy. Townshend was convinced that Britain's principal enemy was now Austria. However, Walpole and Pelham-Holles saw Spain as the main threat to British power, due to their large navy and colonial interests. Eventually, Walpole had his way, forcing Townshend from office and replacing him with Lord Harrington. From then on, Pelham-Holles served as the senior Secretary of State and largely controlled British foreign policy himself. Pelham-Holles was saddened by the demise of his relative and former patron, although their partnership had become increasingly strained, and the new situation offered enormous possibilities to him personally. Together, Pelham-Holles and Walpole managed to drive a wedge between Spain and Austria, making an ally out of the latter, and directing their future efforts against Spain. Subsequently, however, it turned out that Britain's long-term major rival was neither but France, which had been considered a close ally. The increasingly confrontational actions of the French PM, Cardinal Fleury, soon convinced them that they had been wrong. This misjudgment was later used by the Patriot Whigs to castigate the ministry for their lack of preparation against the French threat. In general, Pelham-Holles shared Walpole's abhorrence of war, wishing to prevent Britain from getting dragged into major wars on the continent. Notably, Britain did not become embroiled in the War of Polish Succession, and indeed tried to prevent it from breaking out. Pelham-Holles attempted to throw both the French and Austrians off guard by being cagey about Britain's response if war broke out, but that did not stop the conflict. Once the war had started, George II tried to push for Britain to honour its commitment to assist Austria, but he was blocked by Walpole, who insisted that Britain should not join the war. Pelham-Holles broadly supported the same position as the king, however, but he accepted the decision. His brother Henry had now attained the lucrative position of Paymaster General and had effectively replaced Townshend as a third man of the government. The three men continued what had become dubbed as the Norfolk Congress by meeting regularly at Houghton Hall, Walpole's country house in Norfolk. The three men would hold private meetings, draw up wide-ranging policies on foreign and domestic issues, and then present them to Parliament for their seal of approval, which their large majority allowed them to do so. Slowly, however, the Pelhams were moving out of the shadow of Walpole and being more assertive. Pelham-Holles was particularly annoyed both by what he saw as the abandonment of Austria and by the suggestion that Walpole no longer trusted him. By 1735, Pelham-Holles had largely assumed control of colonial affairs, further increasing the amount of patronage he controlled. A devout Anglican, he also was given control over ecclesiastical matters, especially the appointment of bishops and lucrative positions in the Church of England. Pelham-Holles' growing independence from Walpole was helped by the support of his brother Henry and his friend the Earl of Hardwicke, who would become Lord Chancellor. During the latter half of the decade, his job was increasingly dominated by managing relations with Spain, including trade disputes and objections to the controversial founding of the American colony of Georgia in 1733. The long-standing peace policy was now beginning to look extremely fragile. He also acted as a mediator in the War of the Polish Succession, helping to bring the conflict to an end in 1738. The growing tension between Britain and Spain came to a head in 1731 during an incident known as Jenkins' Ear. A British merchant captain was captured for illegal trading off the coast of Cuba by a Spanish privateer, and in punishment for his alleged breach of the strict laws forbidding foreign commerce with Spanish colonies, had an ear cut off. The incident shocked Britain not so much because of its brutality, but because many saw it as an outrage that Spain should have the temerity to harm a British subject simply for trading, which many held to be a legitimate occupation. In 1738, Jenkins appeared in Parliament to testify about his treatment. Other merchants sent petitions and the powerful South Sea Company mobilised popular opinion. To many, the Spanish Empire was crumbling, and its South American possessions were ripe for the picking. A vociferous group in Parliament demanded war with Spain. However, Walpole was adamantly opposed to such a policy, and became a target for unprecedented attacks, as did Pelham-Holles, coming under intense pressure, but initially considered the demand for Britain to declare war with Spain a dangerous step. In spite of his increasingly bellicose statements, he still considered the idea of an Anglo-Spanish alliance as late as 1739. He tried to negotiate a solution to the crisis with the Convention of Pardo, which agreed a sum of compensation to be paid to British merchants. British opinion, however, had shifted, and Walpole felt that there was no option but to declare war in December of 1739. Britain opened the war with a victory, capturing Portobello in Panama. This led to an outbreak of patriotic fervour and further increased the pressure on Walpole and Pelham-Holles for their perceived unwilling prosecution of the war. Pelham-Holles tried to combat that by cultivating a reputation as the leading patriot of the cabinet. He took on additional military responsibilities, and for the first 2 years of the war served as a de facto Minister of War. One of his most notable suggestions during the period was the recruitment of large numbers of troops drawn from the American colonies, whose growing manpower had previously gone untapped. In 1741, the main British campaign against Spain was a combined amphibious attack on the South American city of Cartagena, which had experienced considerable delays. Command was awarded to Admiral Edward Vernon, the victor of Portobello, and was given a force of 31,000 soldiers and sailors to take the city. The siege proved to be a total disaster for the British, losing thousands of men before being forced to withdraw. Although Pelham-Holles had issued the orders and overseen the organisation of the expedition, much of the blame for the disaster fell on the soldiers of the ailing Prime Minister, Walpole. In the wake of the Cartagena disaster, Britain held a general election. The result reduced Walpole's former dominance of the House to an unworkable majority. Within months, he had been forced out of office and succeeded by Lord Wilmington. Though Pelham-Holles stayed with Walpole to the end, he was later accused by many of Walpole's supporters of having undermined him. Horace Walpole, his son, continued to attack Pelham-Holles' behaviour for years to come. Pelham-Holles continued in office after Walpole's fall, however, becoming more powerful and his younger brother Henry becoming Prime Minister in 1743. Together, they and their supporters, known as the Old Whigs, made a coalition with the New Whigs, previous opponents of the Walpole government. However, there remained a strident opposition led vocally by men like William Pitt and Lord Sandwich. In 1740, shortly after the declaration of war with Spain, a separate war had broken out simultaneously in Europe, into which the War of Jenkins' Ear soon became submerged. In a dispute over the throne of Austria, both France and Prussia had invaded Austria and planned to remove Empress Maria Theresa to replace her with their own claimant. Austria's long-standing alliance with Britain, however, required the latter to declare war. It was also considered by many that a French victory would leave them too strong in Europe. However, Britain soon found itself dragged into this wider war despite the reluctance of its government. Initially, Britain's involvement was limited to financial subsidies and diplomacy in support of Austria, but by 1742 it was apparent that a more substantial commitment would be needed if the alliance were not to end in defeat. That same year, 16,000 British troops were sent to the continent. Pelham-Holles was a staunch Austrophile and strongly supported aid to the Austrians. He had long thought that the only way Britain could defeat France was in alliance with Austria, a view sharply at odds with many other leading politicians such as Walpole and Pitt. Pelham-Holles' position had briefly been threatened by Carteret, a royal favourite, but by 1743, Pelham-Holles and his brother were firmly in control of British policy until 1756. Pelham-Holles now set about drawing up a fresh scheme to enhance British power on the continent, including an attempt to persuade the Dutch Republic into the anti-French alliance and mediating the dispute between Austria and Prussia, inevitably leading to the Treaty of Dresden in 1745. He also approved plans for a colonial raid against Louisbourg in 1745, which was successful. Along with the defeat of a Spanish invasion of Georgia in 1742, this strengthened the British position in North America. However, issues were soon to come closer to home. In 1745, the Jacobite Rising broke out in Scotland and soon spread to northern England. Pelham-Holles feared an attack from the north by Bonnie Prince Charles Stuart, who had already gathered 5,000 men in Derby, and a French invasion of southern England. In the panic, a number of false rumours circulated around London, including the news that Pelham-Holles had fled to the continent for fear that all was lost. He was forced to show himself to a crowd that had gathered outside Newcastle House to prove that he was still there. Nonetheless, his position was threatened since, if the Jacobites were triumphant, his estates would likely have been confiscated and he would have been forced into exile. However, he awoke to the threat posed by the Jacobites much faster than George II and many of his colleagues, who dismissed the rebellion as a farce. Pelham-Holles organised a response, and by late 1745 he had rallied all of the southern militias and regular forces. The Jacobites withdrew to northern Scotland, where they were defeated at Culloden in 1746. On the continent, the British continued the war effort, but were now under pressure from the Dutch Republic to make peace with the French. The Dutch feared that the French would soon launch a devastating onslaught and overrun their country. Pelham-Holles considered that any peace that would be made would be extremely disadvantageous to Britain, and he tried to keep the anti-French coalition strong through constant diplomacy and offers of financial subsidies. Talks for a peace settlement were convened in the city of Breda in 1746. Pelham-Holles was instrumental in securing the appointment of Lord Sandwich as the British representative at the talks. His views were very close to his own. Sandwich's principal instructions were to delay the talks until a significant British victory allowed them to negotiate from a position of strength. The Congress of Breda did not progress well initially because the participants were not yet fully committed to peace. The Allies continued to do badly by suffering severe defeats at Bergen-op-Zoom, sorry if I've completely butchered that word, and Lofeld. Pelham-Holles' brother, Henry, was now strongly advocating peace, but Pelham-Holles firmly rejected that since he was still convinced a major Allied victory was imminent. In 1747, Pelham-Holles was involved in organising a coup to put the Prince of Orange in power in the Netherlands. Orange was wanted to continue the war with the French, but soon had to apply to the British for a massive loan. Pelham-Holles, now aware of how close the Dutch were to collapsing altogether, reluctantly turned towards seeking a peace accommodation with France. He berated himself for his ignorance, obstinacy, and credulity, and half expected his misjudgment in putting so much faith in the Dutch to result in his dismissal. But both the king and the rest of the cabinet retained their faith in him. To oversee the peace settlement, Pelham-Holles switched across to the position of Northern Secretary. He secured Sandwich's promotion to the Admiralty, although he had wanted Sandwich to succeed him as Southern Secretary. During the summer of 1748, Pelham-Holles made his first ever trip outside of Britain when he visited Hanover, and was received with a rapturous reception wherever he went. When the talks got underway, they went far more smoothly, and in October 1848, the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle was formally concluded. Britain would give back Louisbourg to France in exchange for the return of Madras and a full French withdrawal from the Low Countries. The issue of free trade, for which Britain had gone to war with Spain in 1739, was not mentioned at all. Pelham-Holles, however, was immediately attacked by his opponents for giving up Louisbourg, but many of them failed to realise how weak the British position on the continent had become. Austria was also deeply unhappy as they felt the British had abandoned them and had not tried enough for Silesia to be returned. Nonetheless, Pelham-Holles was happy with the terms that had been gained, and observers on the continent were full of praise on how he had overturned such a disadvantageous situation. Following the peace, Pelham-Holles began to put in practice a policy that he had been developing for a very long time. He believed that the stately quadrille, which had seen states continually shifting alliances, had been unstable and led to repeated wars. He wanted to instead use vigorous diplomacy to create a lasting peace that would be built around a strong and stable British alliance with Austria. Like many Whigs, he saw maintaining the European balance of power as essential. He described this process as restoring the old system, but it was popularly known as the Newcastle system. Pelham-Holles was still under continuous attack from Pitt and the Patriot Whigs, a group of Whigs opposed to Walpole and his political allies like the Pelhams. They despised his European policy because of their belief that the previous war had shown that North America was increasingly the most important theatre of war. They mocked him for his perceived lack of vision and ignored the complex nature of European politics and Britain's relationship with Hanover, alongside the fact that as early as 1740, Pelham-Holles had been aware of the expanding power of the American colonies. Though Pelham-Holles remained extremely attentive to the Austrian alliance, he spent several years trying to secure the election of Maria Theresa's son, the future Emperor Joseph II, as King of the Romans, a title of the Holy Roman Empire that carried enormous prestige, but little real power, only to see the scheme fail because of Austrian indifference. There were a number of warning signs that all was not well with the alliance, but Pelham-Holles ignored most of them, since he was convinced that neither Austria or Britain had any other serious potential allies to turn to. Referring to the election, Pelham-Holles believed that if his scheme failed, France and Prussia will dictate to all the world. He managed to broker a compromise at a Congress of Hanover to secure the election of Joseph. His triumph at the Congress was soon undermined by his failure to secure Austrian backing. Pelham-Holles did, however, have some successes elsewhere, managing to outmaneuver the Duke of Bedford by engineering his resignation and the dismissal of Lord Sandwich, whom Pelham-Holles had now begun to consider a dangerously ambitious rival. The ease with which he did so demonstrated his total control of British politics, as Bedford led a strong faction. He had, however, made a significant enemy who would later try to undermine Pelham-Holles. In 1752, he made a rare trip accompanying George II on his annual trip to Hanover. During this visit, he made an attempt to cultivate Lord North, a future Prime Minister, as an ally into his political faction. However, he was unsuccessful, although both became good friends, and North would later go on to speak out in defence of Pelham-Holles. 1754 would see the start of Pelham-Holles' own reign as Prime Minister begin, with his brother Henry dying in early March. Pelham-Holles succeeded him as Prime Minister, even though he initially hoped to stay in his role as Northern Secretary, as he much preferred foreign affairs, but he was persuaded there was no other serious candidate, and accepted the seals of office from the King. His first task was to select someone to represent the government in the Commons as leader of the House. To great surprise, however, he rejected the favourites William Pitt and Henry Fox, opting to go with Sir Thomas Robinson instead, a man who had barely even been considered as a candidate by most. Pelham-Holles was largely instrumental in appointing men considered slightly weaker so that he could dominate them. Both Pitt and Fox bore a grudge over the perceived slight and stepped up their attacks on the ministry. In April and May 1754, Pelham-Holles oversaw a general election, largely adopting the electoral strategy drawn up by his brother and winning a large majority. His own personal ability to have MPs elected on his slate reached new heights. He now felt emboldened enough to try and push through some financial reforms. He proposed measures to reduce the amount of interest paid to the Bank of England on the national debt. His decision to do so may partly have been to deflect criticism that he was not sufficiently qualified on financial matters to control the treasury. At the same time, he was largely directing foreign policy, his main emphasis. The rivalry between Britain and France in North America had been growing for some time. Both coveted the Ohio Country, which offered enormous potential for a new wealthy colony to be founded. Both nations sent military forces to occupy the territory. While Britain set up the first initial post, they were driven out by a French expedition in 1754, what's known as the Battle of Fort Necessity. Many wealthy Americans agitated for military action, but the preparations of the individual colonies for conflict were poor. There was more pressure in London from patriot Whigs who felt the time was ripe for British America to expand into the interior. In 1755, a major expedition, known as the Braddock Expedition, was planned against the French in America. A force of British regulars would be sent to seize Ohio, while another of New England provincials would take control of Nova Scotia. A new commander-in-chief, Edward Braddock, would be appointed to oversee that to take over from the fractious efforts of the colonial assemblies. The architect of the scheme was the Duke of Cumberland, who held enormous political sway at the time. Braddock was a favourite, yet Pelham-Holles had his doubts about him and the plans themselves. Pelham-Holles had temporarily made an alliance with Henry Fox, whom he also disliked. Fox, however, was a strong supporter of the campaign and forced Pelham-Holles' hand. A few months after arriving in America, Braddock's force was engulfed by disaster at the Battle of Monongahela. Attacked by a mixed force of French and American natives in the wilderness, more than half were killed, including Braddock himself. The remaining survivors retreated back to Philadelphia, leaving the French in full control of the interior. The Nova Scotia scheme had been more successful, but the great expulsion which followed in its wake created serious headaches for Pelham-Holles. All had taken place without war being formally declared, however. With the decline in the American situation, Pelham-Holles was forced to abandon his plans for financial reform, as the money would instead need to be spent on military forces. While Pelham-Holles had been paying attention to the American campaign, more pressing events in Europe demanded his attention. Austria had been growing increasingly tense because of a long-standing belief that the British would abandon it at a crucial moment. Pelham-Holles' worst fears were confirmed in 1756, when Austria concluded an alliance with France, known as the Diplomatic Revolution. Suddenly, the whole balance of power in Europe had changed. Pelham-Holles had hoped to prevent the outbreak of a major war in Europe by encircling France with hostile powers. He believed that would both deter them from attacking their neighbours and from sending reinforcements to North America. He thought that the only way war could happen now was if Frederick the Great, the Prussian king, unilaterally attacked Austria. However, the clear disparity in numbers would make him a madman to do so. Pelham-Holles hoped he had managed to avert war in Europe, but in 1756 Frederick invaded Saxony and Bohemia, triggering the major European war that Pelham-Holles had feared and failed to prevent. What had begun as a limited war in the Ohio Country between Britain and France now took on a global proportion. Pelham-Holles was widely blamed for Britain's poor start to the 7 Years' War, and in November 1756 he was replaced by the Duke of Devonshire. Some had even called for his execution after the loss of Minorca in 1756. Instead, the commander of the British fleet, John Byng, was shot after a court-martial which many considered a smokescreen to protect Pelham-Holles. However, in July 1757, Pelham-Holles returned to the post of Prime Minister. This was because William Pitt, the driving influence on policy in Devonshire's cabinet, could not control enough support in Parliament. It is often incorrectly stated that Pitt was Prime Minister during the war, but Pelham-Holles actually held the office. Their relationship grew into a fruitful partnership and provided a determined leadership that some had felt had been lacking for some time. On paper, though, it was an implausible alliance. Pitt had been a strident critic of Pelham-Holles for years, and they had separate, conflicting visions of strategy. Pelham-Holles saw Britain's best chance of victory in directing resources to the war on the continent, but Pitt wanted a wholesale shift in policy to concentrate British forces in North America, West Africa, and Asia, where the French were most vulnerable. However, they shared some views, such as being ardent Whigs, and had even once tried to create a political alliance. Pelham-Holles had previously tried to have Pitt appointed Secretary of War in 1745, but George II vetoed the appointment. Ultimately, British policies were formed on a mixture of these two views. Pelham-Holles insisted on a British involvement on the continent to tie down French troops and to authorise a number of expeditions against French colonies. As they were successful, the expeditions began to grow in number and size. Pitt largely took over control of directing them, and Pelham-Holles agreed with the measures and made sure that Parliament was kept on side by mobilising his control of MPs. However, Pitt and Pelham-Holles would discuss strategy alone with a small number of other figures, such as Edward Legionnaire, Philip York, and George Anson. Pelham-Holles had been deeply concerned by Britain's poor start to the war, particularly the loss of Minorca and the French occupation of key ports in the Austrian Netherlands. To try to boost Britain's position in the Mediterranean, he pushed for an invasion of Corsica, which was then controlled by neutral Genoa, to use as a naval base or for a British attack on Ostend to drive the French out. Pitt was alarmed that both prospects would lead Britain into war with Austria or Genoa. Instead, to placate Pelham-Holles and George II, Pitt agreed to send a British contingent to fight in Germany in 1758. In 1758, Pitt began dispatching the expeditions around the world to seize French colonies. In the same year, they captured Senegal and Gambia in West Africa and Louisbourg in North America. He planned to intensify this the next year by dispatching large expeditions to the West Indies and Canada. To do so, Pitt stripped the British Isles of troops and ships, which causes Pelham-Holles to worry that they were ill-defended. His fears increased when the British received intelligence of French plans to launch an invasion of Britain. Pitt was determined to press ahead with that year's plans, but agreed to lessen the scale of colonial expeditions for 1760, since he expected that 1759 would provide a knockout blow to the French war effort. Pelham-Holles had retained his previous belief that Britain needed to create as broad a coalition as possible, and that Europe, rather than the Americas, would be decisive. He thus attempted to persuade a number of different states to join the anti-French alliance. He was largely unsuccessful since the Dutch, Danes and Portuguese remained neutral, and Sweden and Russia joined the French and Austrians in attacking Prussia. He authorised large sums to be paid as subsidies to the Prussians, who were fighting countries whose land forces dwarfed their own. One of Pelham-Holles' greatest personal achievements was his use of diplomacy to keep Spain out of the war until 1762, when it was too late to alter the balance of power significantly. In 1759, he and Pitt organised Britain's defences against a planned French invasion, which fell because of British naval victories at Lagos and Quiberon. The Broad-Bottom government, under which Britain gained reputation abroad, gradually fell owing to the affection of the new king, George III, for Lord Bute, who, having supplanted Pitt, became Prime Minister in place of Pelham-Holles in May 1762. George III had described Pitt as a snake in the grass and Pelham-Holles as a knave. Despite their undeniably competent prosecution of the war, the new king did not trust either man with the future of Britain and cast them both into opposition. It marked arguably the last occasion upon which a British monarch was able to remove a prime minister purely out of personal animosity. That privilege would be, in the future, ceded entirely to Parliament. As Bute was a Tory, this marked the end of the Whig monopoly on government, which had been continual since the Hanoverian succession in 1714. After his dismissal, he went into opposition and lost his 2 Lord Lieutenancies for opposing the peace in 1763, the Treaty of Paris. Along with Pitt, he felt the terms of peace were overly generous to France and Spain because of the position of strength held by the British. Many territories captured during the war were handed back, but the French presence had been effectively destroyed permanently in Canada and India. He spent much of his time at his house at Claremont, which he considered one of his finest achievements. Pelham-Holles had been in government for almost 45 continuous years and initially enjoyed the new freedom that opposition gave him. However, he would make one final return to a position of power in 1765 when he became Lord Privy Seal in the government of Lord Rockingham. Pelham-Holles was at one point offered the position of Southern Secretary by the King, but he turned it down. He lasted for a few months before the government collapsed, which was replaced by that of the Duke of Grafton. Yet he still remained in active opposition, but accepted he would not hold office again. He continued to wield enormous patronage and influence, but his health swiftly gave way after a stroke in December 1767, which left him impaired in both speech and memory. In his final few months, he had counselled against the coercive acts on British America. The Duke was industrious and energetic, and to his credit, the statesman who almost monopolised the patronage of office for half a century twice refused a pension and finally left office £300,000 poorer than he entered it because of his heavy spending on political campaigns, his lavish lifestyle, and his neglect of the family budget. Pelham-Holles died in November 1768, aged 75.